we should get started here. So first of all, thank you for joining us for what's going to be an interesting 15 minutes. My name is Hannah Miro, and I will be background moderating the chat and helping with any technical difficulties during this session. This session now is Wild Rice, Interweaving Knowledge Types to Protect the Cultural and Ecological Integrity of Manoomin. Before we begin, I'd like to mention just a couple of housekeeping notes. So first, on the right hand of your screen, you will see a few chat options to keep things simple. The session chat is where we would like you to share your questions and comments. Please avoid using the Q&A chat space and the event chat space because we may not see all of your comments or questions. Second, this session is being recorded and will be made permanently available on the Wild Rivers Conservancy YouTube channel. During this session, there may be an opportunity for you to ask questions or participate by using video or audio. If you do not want to be recorded, we just ask that you don't ask to share your video or audio. If you have any questions during the presentation, we encourage you to type those questions into the chat. So with all of that housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to introduce our speakers and give the rest of the time to them. So please welcome Kathy Smith and Amy Cottrell of the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission.
Abujud and my bog ganadug. Wasan no day que nijanakas. Mayingan indodam. Inishanabe mede que indao. Wakwe dung indunjaba. My given name is Kathleen Smith. I'm a Cuna Bay Indian Community enrolled member located in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. In my traditional greeting, I said, hello, all my relatives. I am called Northern Lights Woman. My clan is Wolf. I am woman from a certain place from along the water. I work with wild rice stewardship, integrating traditional knowledge with my work here with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. My position is an Ojibwe Mowin, for she who takes care of the wild rice.
Thanks, Kathy. And I am Amy Cottrell, and I am the wetland ecologist here at Cliffwick, and I work with Kathy to steward wild rice, and then I also work with migratory waterfowl. So Kathy's going to kick off our presentation today.
So our presentation today is interweaving knowledge types to protect cultural and ecological integrity of Manoomin. So who is Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission? We were formed in 1984 and we represent 11 Ojibwe tribes in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Member tribes reserve the right to hunt, fish, and gather in the 1836, 1837, 1842, and 1854 treaties with the United States government. We provide natural resource management expertise, conservation, enforcement, legal and policy analysis, and public information services in support of the exercise of treaty rights during wild-regulated off-reservation seasons throughout the ceded territories. They're not advancing. They're not advancing. Okay, there we go. So the ceded territories in Minnesota are Mille Lacs and Fond du Lac are the member tribes. Wisconsin member tribes are St. Croix, Red Cliff, Bad River, Lac du Flambeau, Lac Courte Oreille. In Michigan, we have Lac Vieux Desert, Bay Mills, and Cuna Bay Indian Community. GLIFIC is governed by the Board of Commissioners, Voight Intertribal Task Force, and Great Lakes Fisheries Commission. So we actually are, a part of a lot of different tribes, and they have leaders that come in to be a part of these committees. So treaty rights are reserved for GLIFIC member tribes, signed treaties in the 1836, 37, 42, and 54 with the United States government. In those treaties, they have ceded, which is sold land in northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, but retained the rights to hunt, fish, and gather in ceded territories. Treaty rights were initially ignored when the states assumed statehood and began regulating their own natural resources. Treaty rights were actually affirmed in the mid-1900s. The tribes sought legal affirmation of treaty rights. Several positive court decisions ensued that the Northwest and the Great Lakes region that affirmed treaty rights and ruled for self-regulation. So looking ahead with our presentation today, we will look at the cultural significance, Manoomin ecology, impacts and threats, harvesting and processing wild rice, and stewardship. So according to oral tradition, the Anishinaabe people, also known as Ojibwe, followed a metis shell in the sky. This took place 1,000 years ago to find a place where the food grows on the water. The journey led them along the St. Lawrence River from the east coast of the United States to what is now known as the Great Lakes region, which includes parts of the United States and Canada that surround the 5 Great Lakes. Anishinaabe settled in the Great Lakes region because of the Manoomin, wild rice. So we have a symbolic petition of the Chippewa chiefs. Chief Buffalo's petition originally was on birch bark and was carried by the Skabewis, who is depicted here as the blue figure right here. In Washington in 1849, when the tribes petitioned the U.S. to adjust boundaries of the 1842 La Pointe Treaty. Elders say that the lines from the hearts and the eyes of the Dodems, the clans, of the representatives of the delegates, which is the catfish over here to the far left, the manfish, the bear, makwa, and the 3 martins. To the heart and eye of the crane. So you can see the lines here that go to the heart and the eye of the crane. And they actually signify that all the headmen shared the same views. The last line that's going out from the crane's eye, it actually goes out and it indicates to the entire group had authorized Chief Buffalo from the Crane clan to speak to the President Fillmore on their behalf. The lines were to indicate that the Washington politician, that the various clans were of one mind and heart and connected to the chain of wild rice lakes right here. You can see that, signifying the unity of the purpose of the delegation. So we must ask, what is the connection that Anishinaabe has to wild rice, known to Anishinaabe as Manoomin and Ojibwe Mowin, which means the good berry? It became a spiritual and cultural staple that feeds out of the mind, body, and spirit. Wild rice is an important food source and medicine for tribal people and wildlife. It is used widely as a spiritual offering in many ceremonies today. The Creator's Garden, Manadu Gitagan, includes all people who we consider our relatives, along with other animal, plant, and water relatives, and all others that are found in a particular place that has been as a gift to Anishinaabe with all things that we need to survive. As Anishinaabe, we are embedded with the natural environment around us that is both have spiritual connections and material things. It is a responsibility that we care for the rice beds like gardens and the abundance that exists within them. In our teachings, we are required to establish a relationship with other beings in the Creator's garden, and we must be aware of that mistreating them can actually have a consequence also.
All right, so now we're going to move a little into more of the ecology and life history of wild rice. And when we say Manoomin, we're talking about wild rice, and in this context, it's mostly northern wild rice. There are 2 species, northern and southern wild rice, native to this region, but for this talk, we're mostly referring to the northern species. Wild rice is an annual aquatic grass, which means that there's no dormancy stage for the plant itself. It relies on the seed of the previous year's crop to succeed and to grow. And so wild rice goes through 4 different life stages: overwintering, submergent, floating leaf, and emergent. And this next slide shows a close-up of those 2 different species. On the left, the rice on the left side of the penny is the northern wild rice grain, which is a little bit larger, a little bit more robust in terms of what it provides as a food source. And the rice on the right side of the penny is the southern wild rice, so it's a smaller grain. And then, okay, moving on. The northern wild rice has a historic range that looks pretty broad across North America, from Canada all the way down to the Midwestern part of the U.S. Northern or wild rice in general has been introduced into the western part of the United States, and it's more of a cultivated crop over there. So historically, it had a pretty broad range. But when we zoom in to a more state level, a more local level distribution, next slide, we see that it's really not that prevalent in Minnesota or Wisconsin, which are the 2 states that have the highest historical abundance. And so this figure on the left here shows the watersheds where wild rice was historically found, estimated to be found from about 1900 to 1995. And then those watersheds that currently contain wild rice have a hatching over the top. So you can see that some of those watersheds have lost their wild rice presence. And then the figure on the right shows the actual water bodies or lakes or rivers that contain today wild rice within those watersheds. So it's really not that broad of a distribution. And these maps are more than 10 years old now at this point. And so it's likely that some of those water bodies no longer support wild rice. Next. And so these are some examples of where you find wild rice up here. They can be found in rivers. In the top figure, usually along the edges of meandering sections of rivers. So all of that light green coloring is probably most likely wild rice. Below that is a picture of a lake, a natural lake. And so wild rice tends to exist in areas along the lake edges where there's some flow. So usually at the inlet and outlet sections of those water bodies. And then on the left side is an image of a flowage, which is a man-made structure created using an impoundment, so an impounded river. And the same thing there, the wild rice tends to exist in the inlet and outlet sections of those. Next. So ideally, wild rice has some parameters that it tends to thrive most in. So typically in wetland or shallow water bodies that have a soft, mucky sediment, so lakes that maybe aren't the most exciting to walk through, that type of sediment tends to really support wild rice. They're most often found in depths of 1/2 to 3 feet deep. So shallow lakes, shallow water bodies. And they also tend to prefer some sort of flow, a slow to moderate flow of water. So some cycling or renewal of nutrients is good for wild rice. And they also, wild rice really thrives when there's slight disturbance. So something like, a storm or a drought or something that comes somewhat intermittently is helpful for wild rice because it does rely on that nutrient cycling that comes with disturbance. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, wild rice has 4 stages that it goes through to complete its life cycle, and it kind of lines up with the seasons that we associate with. So during fall, the seeds mature and release from the plant, and this is when harvesting occurs. And the seeds that aren't harvested just tend to fall down into the water column and embed themselves into the sediment. And each seed has something called an awn that sticks out the edge of the seed that contains these barbs that help to both fend off predation from wildlife and also assists the seed in burrowing down into that mucky sediment that we talked about before. So during winter, the seed remains in the sediment, typically requires a good hard freeze for an extended period of time. So sometimes when we have more mild winters where we don't have a super cold freeze, the rice yield tends to be lower the following year. Then in spring, everything starts to thaw and those seeds start to germinate by mid-April. And oftentimes by the end of May and early June, the plants enter their submergent stage, and you can start to see the beginning of that plant, which is about 6 to 12 inches long. And wild rice then continues to grow up to the surface and enters the floating leaf stage around June. And after that, it breaks the surface of the water and grows to the end of June. The plant enters the emergent stage and reaches about 2 to 6 feet in height above the water surface. Moving through the year to midsummer, each stem or each plant produces a male and a female flower at the top of the plant. And those male flowers open late July. Cross-pollination ensues via wind pollination. And then the seeds reach maturity around mid to late August and September. And that's when wild rice is harvested. So the next slide just shows some close-ups of each of those flowers with the male flower on the left, the female flowers in the middle, and then the final rice seed at the top or on the right at the top of the plant. So those flowers are really, really tiny. And the next slide just is a visual example of how one water body can vary quite visually by season. And so this goes in a clockwise direction from the top, which would be early spring, shortly after everything thaws, where we don't see any aquatic vegetation in the water, to summertime when we start to see floating leaf vegetation, and then moving down to maybe midsummer, the third plant, where we have possible herbivory by waterfowl, or the plant is still growing into that emergent stage. And then the final photo shows the mature plant with the mature seed heads. Wild rice also tends to vary quite a bit annually across years within the same water body. So these are 3 aerial photos of the same lake taken 1 year apart. And you can really see the variation in vegetation on those lakes. So the first photo has maybe a mild crop of wild rice. The second year have virtually no wild rice present. And then the third year is pretty full, pretty dense stand of wild rice. So because of this variation, which some of it is understood and some of it is not, and some of it occurs internally within the ecosystem, and some of it occurs from external inputs, it's very difficult to predict or estimate what harvest or what yield will be like in a given year. So wild rice, next slide. Wild rice, in addition to providing food source, it contributes quite a bit to the ecosystem that it lives in. It's very, very good at keeping and holding nutrients within its dense root masses within the sediment. And so it can help prevent or at least minimize algal blooms within the water bodies. It also acts as a filter to improve water quality and clarity. So it sort of acts as a filtration process. It can reduce wave action or produce the water or keep the water from sloshing around and really maintain the wetland plant community complexity. It provides nutrient dense forage for lots of different animals, and it also provides protection and habitat availability for nesting animals. And these are some of the animals that we often find in these wild rice ecosystems. So from the top left, we have a black tern. The next one over is a sora, which is a rail species. We have tundra and trumpeter swans. And then moving down to the bottom left, different types of ducks, muskrats, and then something called a rice worm, which is very heavily reliant on wild rice to thrive. So like everything else, wild rice faces a lot of threats. And I chose this photo because it's a really good representation of how a wild rice bed can vary quite substantially across years. So this is showing from the year 2000 to 2010, each different colored line, polygon or shape represents the outline of the wild rice crop for that year. So just across years within this small section of a lake, there's a lot of variation. So there's a lot of annual variability as we mentioned before, but there's also these external impacts. And a lot of those are things that are the wild rice didn't evolve to deal with or interact with. So things like shifts in the hydrological regime or the way the water flows, the construction of impoundments, the failure of impoundments or dams, different development types, so development along the shoreline, urban development, nutrient runoff, and then invasive species and different components of climate change. So increases in temperature, increases in precipitation, and then increases in frequency of things like that, which lead to flooding and droughts and different storms that we have in the winter. So all of this makes it really difficult to predict and to be good stewards of wild rice. So I'm just going to go through a couple of those threats that are pretty detrimental and kind of serious for wild rice. So first off, we have some of the historical negative effects on or impacts on wild rice are the creation of impoundments, which is very common across the country, across the world, really. And so this really led to a lot of habitat loss and rearrangement during the construction of those dams and different impoundments. So anything that alters the hydrological regime will impact wild rice. The next slide shows a historical map overlaid on top of a present-day map of the Chippewa River. And you can see in this historical map, there are two labels here for wild rice. And so wild rice was documented historically, and presently, this is a place where a flowage was created by installing a dam. And so those wild rice beds were basically flooded out and no longer exist there. Next slide. Another big threat to wild rice is invasive species, and in this case, aquatic invasive species. So this is two images side by side, 10 years apart, of a lake that contains wild rice. So most of this lighter green, again, is going to be wild rice. And the arrows are pointing to the presence of these deciduous trees or coniferous trees. And around the edge of that are a stand of cattails, narrow leaf cattails. And these cattails seem to really be encroaching when you look on the second picture on the right. They really are encroaching into that wild rice habitat and basically taking over. And things like perennial plants that don't require reseeding, floating and submergent vegetation are really good at outcompeting wild rice for space and basically choking them out. And this is a good example of how wild rice really benefits from disturbance because it knocks back some of those invasive species. We also have herbivory impacts, so animals that rely on wild rice for forage or for food. Things like geese and swans and ducks can really be detrimental when that herbivory or that foraging occurs in large quantities. So this is an example of two species or two groups of species that were sort of conservation comeback stories and to the point where these swans and Canadian geese were both causes of concern, and now their populations are so high that they're causing issues and having negative impacts on wild rice. So the next couple pictures show, this one you can't see very well, but here's a family of geese in a wild rice bed. And then the next slide shows a close-up of the effects of those birds foraging or feeding on the wild rice. So on the left, there's a huge stand of wild rice, basically just cut off, and the wild rice is not able to thrive and grow to seed. And so those plants are not useful as seed anymore. And then the next picture, the picture next to that, shows a close-up of the chomped off stems. Okay, and then one of the other threats is, as I mentioned before, extreme weather events. These are two images showing total precipitation or total rainfall for two flooded events that occurred in Minnesota and Wisconsin in 2012 and the other one in 2016. And the next slide shows the effect that had on 3 different lakes in Minnesota. So in 2011, on these 3 lakes, Dean Lake, Mallard Lake, and Flowage Lake, they all had a pretty robust abundance or yield of wild rice. However, the following year, these photos were taken shortly after that storm. Neither of those lakes had very much wild rice at all. And so that flooding event definitely decreased the production or yield of wild rice on these lakes. And then coming back to dams, so impoundments, the creation of impoundments can wipe out wild rice habitat and abundance. And then the failure of dams can also do significant damage. So interestingly, many of the water bodies that we have up here that are flowages or reservoirs or created inland water bodies that have wild rice are flowages. And some of those are wild rice, or some of those have wild rice that are harvested. And when those flowages fail or those dams fail, that can wipe out that entire wild rice crop. And so these pictures here, the one on the left shows the actual failure of the dam, where the dam broke and all the water drained out of the water body. And then the right one was taken later of basically a dry water body bed. And then this is just an aerial image of that same water body 1 year prior, where we had a very lush, very rich crop or yield of wild rice. And then the year following, or 2 years following the dam failure, that flowage was completely dry. So all of that brown is a drained flowage, basically. And then one of the last threats is brown spot disease, which is a fungal disease that can be quite detrimental to wild rice. This can lead to significant yield loss. And this disease is more, this disease is more common, and wild rice is more susceptible in hot temperatures when there's high humidity. So more so in the southern part of the state, but it can occur up here too quite often. And so when we take all of those threats into account, we here at Glyphwick, we do a lot of, one of the things that we do regularly is we collect aerial imagery of, of a number of wild rice water bodies to assess change over years. And okay. And these photos show over time the variation in wild rice abundance across years. And the tribe suggests or believe that wild rice has on average a 4-year cycle, meaning they estimate a lake has maybe 1 poor yield year every 4 years. But when we look at this particular lake, Dean Lake in Minnesota, as an example, next slide, you can kind of see that there were, so the X's represent a failed crop year. So we can see that that 4-year cycle doesn't really exist. We're tending to have more detrimental or low or no yield wild rice lakes more often. So there's a higher frequency of those negative impacts occurring, those external impacts occurring on the lakes. And so this is a real problem. And one of the main, or I should say the main thing that we do here at Glyphwick is we are stewards, and our role is centered around stewardship. And we work to combat these threats and learn more about wild rice. And a main component of stewardship for us is to learn, to listen, and to observe. And we learn through multiple knowledge types. So we attempt to blend traditional ecological knowledge and scientific ecological knowledge to learn more and to be stewards. We also work to protect the wild rice by learning, by actively engaging with wild rice and its habitat. We do a lot of collaborating with partners. So we work with we have professional partnerships with the government agencies, different organizations, academic institutions, and then we work a lot with private landowners and lake association groups. And then last but not least, we do a lot of sharing of knowledge and sharing of information. So we engage with our communities, and we engage with those that live within and around these areas. So just want to touch a little bit more on the learning aspect. To approach stewardship by blending these two knowledge types, we have to be aware of what those two knowledge types represent. And so this is just a quick table that I put together based off of what I've read in the literature and based off conversations I've had with others that highlights the differences between these two knowledge types. So some that I feel are important to point out is scientific or Western ecological knowledge tends to be more quantitative. It is qualitative too, but in general, it tends to be quantitative, whereas TEK is more of a qualitative data collection approach. Scientific ecological knowledge tends to be collected locally, but is kind of broadened out to make more broad assumptions or more large-scale inference, whereas TEK data are often collected locally and that knowledge is applied locally or more on a small scale. Data collected by specialists or scientists are often trained to do so, and so there's often an objectivity about it, and those data are shared in select journals, scientific journals, or papers or formats, so the sharing of those data are limited. Whereas traditional ecological knowledge tends to be communal or cultural knowledge that's collected by individuals, and those data or that knowledge tends to be transferred generationally. And so there's different types of knowledge, and we try to integrate both of those in our work. So just to summarize a couple more of the stewardship practices, a big way that we work on protecting wild rice is collecting data, so doing research, doing monitoring, sort of standardizing the way that we do this so that we can assess change over time. And then we do a lot of restoration work where we attempt to protect and restore wild rice beds so that they can exist into the future for future generations. As I said before, we collaborate. A lot of our collaboration occurs with state and federal agencies and academic institutions, and also private landowners. So these are just a couple of signs that we have, informational signs that we put out on the water. And then I put a picture of one of the invasive aquatic plant removal machinery. And then lastly is sharing and making the information and knowledge accessible and transferable. A really wonderful example of how we share and interweave these knowledge types is exhibited in the harvesting of wild rice, which some of this is represented here, and Kathy will pick up on that.
For those that are lucky enough to live near rice waters, you can enjoy locally harvested wild rice. Wild rice is harvested in the fall, like Amy had said, when the flower heads have ripened and almost turned a rich purple in some instances. Here you have two people using a traditional method of harvesting. The one in the front propels himself in the canoe. The canoe has to be about 17 feet and no wider than 38 inches. due to Wisconsin regulations. You also have to use your muscle power with paddles or a push-pull. The push-pull, usually the length of the canoe is a good rule of thumb. That has a fork on the end so it does not harm the roots of the plant, and the person sitting in the canoe is the one that harvests. So a sustainable method is used to harvest. The person sitting here has a set of flails or knockers. They are smooth, rounded wooden sticks that are no longer than 38 inches and usually made from cedar. Must be operated by the harvester, such as the woman in the picture. The rice stalks are bent over the canoe side gently with one stick, and then the other is slightly tapping the other. As the push puller gently pushes the canoe forward, the harvester alternates and knocks the rice gently into the bottom of the canoe. Some of the seed does fall back into the water as a way of giving back, and it provides seed for the following year's growth. Important to harvest in a good way because of wild rice ripens at a gradual and uneven rate. The season can usually go 2 to 3 weeks. Here you could see an experienced ricer. So if you've seen this picture previously with Amy's presentation, you can actually see here that there's an experienced ricer that can have even parallel lines that are even seen from the aerial photos. This method is sustainable as the stalks can stand back up and other harvesters can go back through the wild rice bed as the rice continues to ripen. Once you are back at shore, the wild rice is first dried using the air and the sun. Traditionally, the wild rice kernels were spread out on a birch bark blanket or container. This method is used to get the moisture out and can take a few days or a little bit longer. This will help the rice from forming mildew and must be dried as soon as possible as it comes from the lake. Constantly turning the rice will help the drying process, and this step prepares it for parching. The dried rice is then parched or roasted over a slow burning wood fire in a large kettle or large pans. It needs to be stirred constantly to prevent scorching with a paddle or even popping of the rice. If you have too much moisture in it, it can pop just like popcorn. Parching kills the germ. It's not a disease, kids, but the living inner kernel of the rice seed. It actually prevents the seed from germinating. Parching hardens the kernel and scorches the long on, as Amy had depicted in the life stage, and it causes the hull to loosen. This method helps preserve the kernels for long-term storage. After parching the wild rice, the hull must be removed by jigging, or we call dancing the rice. A tight-fitting hull is also known as chaff. A small pit is dug, usually 2 to 3 feet in diameter and approximately 18 inches deep. In this picture, the pit is lined with wooden slats, which very much looks like a barrel that was sunken into the ground. This involves real strenuous work. You can use clean or new moccasins. Hold yourself up slightly on the 2 poles using a twisting method to loosen the hull further and separate it from the kernel. After dancing the rice, small amounts are placed into a shallow birch bark tray for winnowing. Wild rice is tossed in the air and repeatedly caught again, sort of like flipping pancakes in a frying pan. And you could always practice that. The broken chaff or husks rise to the top and can be lifted gently by a slight breeze. So with the typical finishing rate, usually you have 100 pounds of green seed, which is harvested by the harvester. And then when you go through the process of processing the rice, you usually get a yield of 40 to 45 pounds of finished rice. So when you do have it shipped off and have somebody else do it professionally or by another processor, you usually have to share your rice and you have to give an in-kind finisher rate. And usually they'll take about 20%, which ends up to be about 35 pounds of finished rice for your pantry. Traditionally, the Ojibwe stored provisions underground, including wild rice. So you can see here, this is the processed rice. It will keep indefinitely if it is not exposed to moisture. Part of the rice is harvest is packed in birch bark containers and buried in a deep pit below the frost line. So today we can actually store rice in glass containers. Also, there is alternatives to speeding up the process of the rice, because much work that the Anishinaabe do is, we really have to work for those good foods and medicines. So we have ways of doing it in a faster way with mechanical thrashers that are used instead of dancing the rice, or even electrical fans and separating the chaff as depicted in these pictures. These traditional methods of harvesting are also used today. It assists with sustainable harvesting, and we are taught to take care and respect the rice, and in turn, it will take care of you. So these are some of the nutritionist facts. I want to leave you with how this food has sustained our people for generations and helps keep us connected to our way of life. On the nutritious value of wild rice, it is rich in antioxidants and is considered one of the healthiest options when compared to white rice. Wild rice has low calorie and higher nutrient value, making wild rice a nutrient-dense food. It does have a great plant-based protein and a good source of minerals, and it's especially gluten-free. So what do we do with our work? We are finding out that critical aspects of the cultural heritage of Indigenous people have been restricted by treaties. We are starting to rely on the knowledge holders to help us identify in which the modern world, which has and has not been identified, incorporated into the stewardship of Manoomin in the ceded territories. The significance of a tribal people retaining control over their cultural resources is that they are provided with the ability to have access to their past, and in order to divine our cultural heritage. The significance of protecting Manoomin for Ojibwe people is to be able to sustain their families, so our people have food security, in which that has been handed down from our ancestors, to have a relationship with the land and to continue to have a sustainable way to harvest, and interweaving the traditional knowledge and with the science world. We are able to identify issues with our relationship and connection to the land, the water, and non-human relatives. Without science, we would not be able to continue to do this work with the understanding to what it is that's impacting our precious gifts that has been gifted to us. Anishinaabe follows natural law. Our cultural knowledge is interweaving with the science world to help protect Manoomin for future generations. This ends our presentation. We are honored and very much thankful to be here in this space to share with you and to bring forth our stewardship to Manoomin. So miigwech for having us.
Well, thank you, Kathy and Amy, for a great presentation. If anybody does have questions, they can feel free to enter that in the chat, or if you'd like to share your audio and video, we can answer and ask questions that way too. I don't see any in the chat box right now. So we'll just give it a minute or two and see if anybody has any questions. And while we wait, I did have a question. As Kathy, you were talking about all the steps that had to happen in order to process the wild rice. How long did that process generally take?
Well, it depends a lot on, the natural environment. Sometimes when we spread out that wild rice, we get rain, we get fog, which has that light moisture. So sometimes we have to bundle it up and take it inside. And then when the sun comes out, then we just kind of spread it out. Like I had said in the presentation, we just got to be careful and take care of that resource. And, mold or mildew or other relatives, like we've had squirrels come and, try to steal the little kernels, as they get ready for their winter rest. But it's very important to really, know how much work that actually goes into it. So when I have participated in a wild rice camp, we usually do the process as far as, drying it and the rest of the processes can take probably pretty much, depending on how much you have, actually, it could take a great stretch of time, but we could do it actually in a weekend, you know, to be able to harvest and process it and to put it into, you know, containers or, you know, little Ziploc bags so we can gift it to our camp participants. So it's usually a long process that actually goes through, you know, a few weeks.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, you know, I don't see any other questions. So I think you guys just did that great of a job explaining everything. So again, I just want to thank you for the presentation and being here with us. And to all of our students and viewers as well, we appreciate you attending. One thing I did want to take a moment to mention is tomorrow we will be having our schoolyard biological diversity investigation. So this opportunity is open to all students of all ages to get outside and learn who inhabits your schoolyard. So when you participate and submit your data, your school will be added to our online watershed map. So I did include the link a little bit earlier in our chat if you'd like to learn more about that. And then lastly, this presentation and all the others from today will be shared on our YouTube channel in the coming days. And okay, one last thing. This is it. You'll also be receiving a survey this afternoon. So please fill out that survey. We'd like to know what you enjoyed about the summit, and maybe if you have some things that could be changed as well. So please fill out that. And again, thank you all for attending.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Which